Society. I am Simone, and on behalf of the Society, I would like to dearly thank you for the very positive feedback that we have received following the first webinar for this term. Your motivation is truly indispensable, and from our end we promise that we keep upping the game. Right, before we move on to today's webinar, I would like to quickly remind you of the pre-publication offer of two of our publications. I'm referring here to Food as Voice, Proceedings of History Week 2017, which is being offered for the price of €15 instead of €20. And then we also have the special edition of the 70th anniversary of the Malta Historical Society, a commemorative publication that's going for €25 instead of €30. But you know what is better still? Getting both copies at a very special price of just €36. Now, isn't that a steal? So hurry up, because this offer is up till the 20th of November. Make sure you visit our Facebook page or our website, from where you can retrieve the link to the order form, and yes, fill it in, submit it to MHS, and you'll get your copies by post. Right, moving on to today's webinar, we have Franco Davis, who will be presenting his talk on sword gifts of the order in early modern Malta. A physiotherapist by profession and very active in martial arts, Davis' connection with and love for history is definitely profound. He has been secretary of the Malta Historical Fencing Association since its inception in 2007, and he also served as secretary of the Malta University Historical Society. Historical interests have led him to an MA in Hospitaller Studies in 2014, which resulted then in extensive research on the practical use and symbolic importance of swords for the order. He cooperated and published a number of articles on the subject, and his research is due to be published as a book in the near future by Heritage Malta. For today's webinar, Davis is going to present us with a snippet from his work. Enjoy.
Hello, I am Franco Davis. I am an alumnus of the Master in Hospitaller Studies course of the University of Malta, and I'm a member of the Malta Historical Fencing Association. My interests lie in the military history of the order in Malta, and in particular in the use and the meaning and the importance of their weapons, particularly their swords. I'd like to thank the Malta Historical Society for inviting me to share some information with you. What I'm going to talk to you today is part of my study on the practical and the symbolic aspects of hospitaller swords. I shall be looking at one particular activity where swords played a heavily symbolic role in the early modern world, which, as the title says, the practice of gift giving. It's an activity influenced by the status and meaning the object in question had on the early modern mind, which is the sword. So the sword is both a material and literary object. So it's a material object, but it's also a literary metaphor. And according to Ludmila Jordanova, some objects, such as portraits, relics, and icons, have enough significance to embody attributes and people. Through this, objects, such as the swords I'm going to be talking about, acquired active lives, power, and were esteemed as symbols of things much larger than the objects themselves. As everybody knows, the sword had a heavily chivalric meaning, and alongside the medieval concept of knighthood, it was a religious icon and a symbol of civic power. It took center stage in hospitaller symbolism, from Grand Master Ladam's Possesso of Indina in the 1530s to the honorific swords bestowed by the Pope to Grand Master Hompesh just weeks before the French invasion in 1798. It is not in paintings, portraits, and monuments alone that the sword took center stage. The symbolic power of the sword is seen in numerous hospitaller rituals and activities. Through its public activities, the order used considerable symbolic weight to remind its watchers of its authority and legitimacy as a sovereign ruler. Two main symbolic themes are identified and they're intertwined. One cannot talk about one without the other. The act of gift-giving and their symbolic use in public ritual. So gifts, which is the subject today. Gift-giving in early modern Europe was a complex diplomatic activity with hidden meanings and obligations, and it revealed the landscape of the power relations between states. In the case of Mediterranean states, the gift had a strong connotation of patronage and fidelity. The Hospitallers were well accustomed to this diplomatic gesture since their origins in the Holy Land. Gifts were given by thankful nobles and kings, and they were their primary income. The Hospitaller order was very active in exchanging gifts and knew how to exploit them to further its own diplomacy. Gifts were given at all levels of the Hospitaller hierarchy and varied from livestock, food, relics, works of art, and of course, swords. Some sword gifts were produced for the specific purpose of gift giving, while others were actual weapons, which were given by the owner. So what follows is an attempt to look at the various swords which have been exchanged to and fro Hospitaller hands and their levels of importance. Now what we see here, for example, is an image printed in the new statutes book issued by Grand Master Verdal in 1588, the Statuta Hospitalis Jerusalem. He had a lot to do to re-establish power as a Grand Master, especially after the turbulent end to Lacassière, his predecessor's reign, which involved an internal rebellion led by the war hero Romegas. So that's another story. But when Verdal got into power, he embarked on a campaign of reform and symbolic propaganda to rebuild the shaken order and his authority. One of which was the status of cardinal given by the Pope Sixtus V in 1587. The image here illustrates the support of the papacy to his leadership. It shows the Pope handing the Grand Master the red and white war tunic of the order and an upright sword. The sword here takes center stage in the exchange and conveys a direct message that Grand Master Verdal was the undisputed leader of the order and defender of the faith, but he is kneeling in front of the Pope, and that is symbolizing that he is answerable only to the Pope. So, the sword of the religion will start by the obvious. The use of swords, such as this one, as receptacles of civic and religious expression in Malta, followed the trend of Europe at the time. Similar sword to this one, for example, in status, is the Sword of Justice in Venice, which was given as a papal gift to the Doge. This sword was transformed from a gift, symbolizing justice, into a civic and religious relic with supernatural powers, gave salvation to whoever touched it and died in battle. It also became like a royal bearing sword. It was a physical embodiment of Venetian autonomy. It was used in civic ritual processions and in state iconography. All its attributes align perfectly with what the Philip II gift sword became for Malta. The most notable of all swords is this one, unquestionably. And it is commonly given many names. It's referred to as Sword of the Religion. It currently resides at the Louvre in Paris with its matching dagger, and now everyone knows how it got there when Napoleon Bonaparte took possession of them in 1798. So in structure, the sword appears to be a typical 16th century early rapier. but the rich gilding and decorations reveal that it is obviously made for ceremony. It was not made for practical use. So this is a gift sword made to be a gift. According to Oliver Renaudot, the sword bears a strong resemblance to 4 other precious gift swords given to European monarchs by the Habsburgs, and most probably came out of the same workshop. This is in line with a trend of weapons gift exchange that occurred during the 16th century. Here we can see another example of a similar gift sword of the time. Most probably, possibly, was from the same workshop. So the sword was given to de Valette in 1566 to honor his victory in the Great Siege of Malta in 1565. A letter written in Spanish and dated in June 1566 can be found in the Liber Consulorum from King Philip II, highlighting the donation of this gift to de Valette. And this statement in Spanish is translated into English, and I shall read it out to you. So, His Majesty the King sends his sword to VS, which is de Valette, most illustrious, in signal of the past victory. For he, with his valor and effort, showed himself to be one of the most leading knights and great captains of the Christian community. And so for this reason, and because His Majesty wishes, so that the whole world would know the great satisfaction to which he holds the person of de Valette, most illustrious, I command for his part that the sword be presented in public. So here we can see that this sword was given, but its giver demands that it's given in ritual. So the Grand Master de Valette would have found difficulty in refusing such a gift from King Philip II, who was technically his feudal lord. This gift, although in recognition of an impressive military achievement, was typical of Habsburg Spain and carried expectations of loyalty. It is interesting to note that, on the other hand, de Valette refused the gift given to him also in recognition of the Great Siege by the Pope, who was his immediate superior. He had offered him the cardinal's hat. He refused it. This may have been made, I would say, to avoid obligations and limitations the title of cardinal would have imposed on the order, on the Grand Master. King Philip II's sword, however, was given as a military symbol, and it fitted perfectly within the Habsburg strategy, and using the order as a shield of their empire. The Grand Master de Valette recognized the powerful symbolic benefits of such a gift, and he astutely turned it around when he decreed that it was to be given to the order and to Malta, rather than to his person, as a reminder of their victory against the Ottomans. The Notizia, which is what you see here, describing this decree by de Valette, stated that it was to be carried in procession by the most honored page every 8th September, and was to be kept with the order's most precious treasures. So, from 1566, the sword was used in every yearly celebration of the Great Siege, as it came to be known from then on. On every 8th September, it was publicly exhibited in procession in a reliquary form. It was used in other public representations also. 2 of them, the main ones, are the possessor ceremonies, which grandmasters made when they visited the towns of Mdina and Birgo after their election. And it was also paraded during the funeral of Grandmaster de Valette himself. It seems that the Grand Master had handled the gift of this sword so well that he turned it not only into a symbol of the order's military achievements, but an icon of the order in Malta. And it immortalized his name as the hero of the Great Siege in steel. Alexandra Walsham describes a relic as a material object that relates to a particular individual or event, where it can be used as an instrument of legitimation of authority, as well as a material manifestation of the act of remembrance. So King Philip II's gift sword, used as a physical token of remembrance of both Grand Master de Valette during his funeral and the victory of the 1565 siege in the 8th September celebrations, but also as a symbol of every successive Grand Master's authority during their possessor ceremonies, perfectly fit this sword into Alexandra Walsham's definition. The sword may not be regarded as a religious relic in the strict sense, since it was not attributed to a saint. It, however, fits into Mario Bohajar's description of hospitaller relics, in being of prime political and religious prestige, as used for gift-making and public ritual. And there you have it. You can see the swords in two paintings with the page holding it up in the Victory Day celebrations. Now, moving on to another sword, which maybe not many people know. We do not have an image of it, so I had to choose one of the person of its owner. So a lesser known, but possibly more prestigious, because of its religious connotation, gift sword was presented to the order while it was still in Rhodes, and it's mentioned in Giacomo Bosio's Historia. It predated the gift given by the King of Spain, and was given by another great patron of the order, France. This illustrates the diplomatic relation the order had with powerful states in Europe, even before their stay in Malta. You have the papacy and patron countries such as Spain and in this case France. So according to Bosio, this sword was given by King Louis XII to Master d'Amboise in 1503 during a diplomatic visit. It is described as the sword the Saint King Louis IX used in his crusades in the 13th century, and was accompanied by a piece of the True Cross. But the order, however, does not seem to have treated this sword with the respect it showed to any of its other gifts and relics. Since Bosio again describes this sword in his Historia as one of the gifts given by the order to the head of the Christian coalition force, the Viceroy of Sicily, Juan de la Cerda, in 1559, on the occasion of the order's participation in the invasion of Tripoli that year against Dragut. It seems this gift, it was again accompanied by the piece of the True Cross, but contrary to King Philip II's sword, which reached iconic status, this sword was treated as any other diplomatic gift the order had in its bank, and it was exchanged as part of its diplomatic relations. It was used as currency. It only stayed in possession of the order effectively for 56 years, and then it moved on. So another hospitaller sword, which is very popular locally, but is shrouded in deeper mystery, even though we know exactly where it is this one. Information about its origins, unfortunately, is scarce, but it merits mentioning because of its strong tradition in local collective memory. It is the reputed personal battle sword of Grandmaster de Valette, donated by the Grandmaster himself, possibly as an ex voto style of donation to the Greek chapel of Our Lady of Damascus in Birgu at the end of the siege. It currently lies within the same chapel, which is now annexed to the Church Museum. Previously, it was the Oratory of St. Joseph, and is displayed with a hat, traditionally also said to have belonged to the Grand Master. So, an intense search through the Order's archives, including, for example, the Liber Consilorum of 1565 to 66, reveals nothing, and even Giacomo Bosio fails to mention it. Other texts on the Great Siege such as Balbi de Correggio's account, also do not mention it. Many modern references to the sword seem to be based on oral tradition and are not backed by historical evidence, such as Elizabeth Schermerhorn's Malta of the Knights. Here is also a list of modern publications mentioning the sword. And the one on top is an illustration of the sword itself in situ in 1851. So what is it? The sword itself is a 16th century battle sword. It is a form of early rapier, commonly referred to as a side sword in the historical fencing world, and is similar to ones produced in Saxony. The width of the blade suggests it is made for battle rather than civilian use, and the lack of decoration, apart from what seems to be a rosary engraved on the blade, are highly suggestive that it could have belonged to a hospitaller. The hat of the Grand Master is commonly seen in portraits and described in ceremonies as a symbol of the magistracy, like the Stockholm Perrier, the sword and hat. And it seems to be a fitting combination to be given as a gift with a sword. A visit to the site reveals a strong local pride in connected to the two items, and they form the centerpiece of the museum with a lot of signage describing them as Grand Master de Valet's relics. The sword and hat are placed inside the cabinet in the chapel of Our Lady of Damascus and seem to lie in their original place, at least since 1779, where we have evidence that the chapel was restored by Grand Master de Rohan. This is a marble plaque located right under the sword, dated 1779, describes the restoration of the chapel, which had fallen into disrepair, and it specifically describes it as the site in which Grand Master de Valet willfully and joyfully hung his sword and hat as thanksgiving to Our Lady of the Victories for the victory, in 1565. So although a search in the statutes of the years 1778 to 1780 for any mention of this restoration also proved futile, the plaque itself, erected during the order's reign in Malta, is very suggestive to the authenticity of it all. So considering the lack of evidence, of written evidence, there are many points in favor of the authenticity of the sword, particularly the marble plaque itself, which seems genuine and specifically mentions the sword and the date the Grand Master donated it. The site in itself, it looks untouched in certain ways and makes historical sense, since the chapel is near the Church of St. Lawrence and a stone's throw away from the main town square, both central locations used daily in the Great Siege by the Grand Master, making the chapel a convenient site for the Grand Master to meditate and pray alone. The Grand Master's dedication, also, to Our Lady is evident in his decree to commemorate the victory of the Great Siege every 8th September in her honor, where he gave the previous sword, the King Philip Sword of the Religion, to be used for this occasion. An act he may have similarly, but more intimately done with his personal sword inside the Greek chapel a few months before. It is, however, also strange that such an important object was not transported to Valletta along with most of the order's important possessions, including the icon of Our Lady itself. Moreover, the lack of written evidence of this ex voto will continue to cast shadows of doubt as to its authenticity, especially since the order tended to be very meticulous in documentation. Regardless, the sword itself holds an enduring power to create a monumental collective memory of a person who may have been seen as a national hero, even though he was not Maltese. There is another beautiful sword which lies in Malta. The act of presenting one's sword to an altar was repeated by at least one other Grand Master, Martin de Redin, in the mid-17th century. The Grand Master presented his rapier to the altar of St. Paul in the Indina Cathedral during his possessor ceremony in 1657. This is the only documented donation of a Grand Master's sword to the Maltese Church, and the sword itself is on display in the Medina Cathedral Museum. The lovely sword in question, which what you see here, is an elegant late 17th century rapier with an exquisitely decorated silver hilt and the Toledo blade. The maker's name and origin are engraved on the blade, Giraldo Ruiz and Toledo. That's what's written on the blade. It is unknown whether he actually used the sword or not, whether it was ordered purposely for the event or not, but whatever the case, the actual donation of a sword to a local entity is very rare and must have been regarded as a great honor, since in the 17th century, a sword was still a very personal item. A similar metal plaque, a small metal plaque, accompanies this sword, bearing the Latin description, identifying it as Grand Master de Redin's, and also giving us the date and occasion during which the sword was given to the church, specifically his possessor ceremony. The cathedral archives describe the sword as being given to the altar of St. Paul as a gift during the act of possession of his principality. It demonstrates a perfect example of a sword being used as a gift from one local ruling entity to another in 17th century Malta. Whether the sword itself was given as a personal ex voto by the Grand Master is doubtful, since there is no reference to a religious vow being made. Also, the term ex voto was coined later in the 18th century. It is probable that the sword was another diplomatic gift from a newly elected Grand Master to the Bishop of Malta. As the order's archives confirm, the sword was given specifically to the bishop as a symbol of the order's commitment to defend the Catholic faith, the Church of St. Paul and Malta. And it further also specifies the Grand Master's request for this gift to be hung in public as a reminder of this promise. The description in the order's archives fails to describe the donation as being given to the altar of St. Paul or not, but rather describes it more to be as a gift to the bishop himself, which is evidence that this was a diplomatic gift. Another lovely sword, which unfortunately does not lie in Malta, papal stock and pilier. Another set of symbolic swords, which is this, given to the order, was given by 4 18th century popes to the Grand Masters of the order in recognition of their roles as defenders of the faith. The stock, the papal stock, which is sword, was part of a set requested by the reigning pontiff of the time every Christmas Eve. And so every Christmas Eve, the Pope would bless the stock and pilier, and then it would be given to a chosen monarch or ruler as a gift. Now, in Malta's case, a total of 4 stock and piliers were given to 4 Grand Masters of the order, all during the 18th century. The first to Grand Master Villena, 1725. The gift included what you can see here, a large, heavily decorated double-handed sword, and a decorated hat, and the belt as well, with the symbol of the Holy Spirit on them. It seems noteworthy that in the 18th century, the rate of their bestowals to European rulers slowed down to a point where in the 18th century, they were only given to the 4 Grand Masters, Villena, Pinto, Jimenez, and Hompesch, and 2 secular monarchs, Prince Eugene of Savoy and King Augustus of Poland. And that's it. There's no other evidence of any others given in the whole century. This may reflect the zeitgeist of the period, since Europe was going through changes due to the Enlightenment, with the Catholic Church seen to have a reduced international stance. Hence, it may be that the popes deemed it fitting that they bestow such honorary gifts at this time to their direct subject, the religious military order of Malta, whose Grand Masters bore an increasingly princely and sovereign posture. This gift may have borne two meanings: the papacy seeking support from the order in an increasingly secularized Europe, but also a reminder to the increasingly princely Grand Masters that they were still subjects to the Pope. The first three Grand Masters made sure they received the gift from the pontiffs publicly, with pomp and ceremony, and a number of relazioni, reports, were published describing the ceremonies made for this gift. The last stock was given in haste in 1798 to Grandmaster Hompesch, only weeks before the arrival of Napoleon, and it seems that Hompesch took it with him when he left Malta, where it currently lies in the order's headquarters in Rome. The lack of any published relazione on the handing over ceremony to Hompesch reveals the turbulent times of 1798, where the order was going through the last days. It seems there was no time or disposition for public ceremonies, and the only proof of this gift, written, is a papal letter which accompanied it and is documented in the last folios of Hompesch Liber Consulorum Status. Here we see De Villena's portrait showing the hat on his left and the sword on his right. The ceremonies for the bestowal of the papal stock and pilier to four Grand Masters of the order in the 18th century, the three Grand Masters, because the last one did not have a ceremony. They were rich in Baroque pageantry and ritual, and they involved the sword as a centerpiece. So only three Grand Masters are documented to have managed the ceremony, since Hompesch, as we said, did not have the time. A study of the details of the actual ceremonies, which we have in the National Library, that took place, reveals the importance given to such a gift by the order. The archival information on the occasion of the sword by Villena, for example, in 1725, is the richest one, since it was the first time such a ritual was made. Due to this, the council had actually elected a special commission to draw up a special ceremonial for the handing over of the gifts from the papal representative. This 4-page report is seen in the first pages of the Liber Consulorum Status of de Villena, where it is immediately followed by a detailed relation of the event. So you can see the importance, because it is in the actual order's archives, and there's a number of pages dedicated to only this. It describes that de Villena made sure he publicized his gift by putting the items on public display for 3 days, depicting them in his official portrait and also in his funerary monument in St. John's Conventual Church, which you can see here. There was even a published relazione of the event in French and Italian to further promote its honor. The same gift was given to Grandmaster Pinto, 1747, Jimenez in 1774, and, as we said, Hompesch, but seem to have been less publicized than de Villena's gift, although both occasions are documented in published relazioni to mark their occasions. So both Grandmasters seem to have not found the same need as their predecessor de Villena to immortalize their stock and piliers in their portraits and monuments. However, the public rituals followed the same pomp and ceremony. All three relazioni of Villena, Pinto, and Jimenez also included illustrations of the papal stock and pilier, which you can see here. These illustrations give an idea on how the sword actually looked like, and it can be observed that they followed the same style as the sword given to Hompesh, the double-handed sword. They were always heavily decorated, two-handed swords, thus being made according to the same style that had been since the tradition actually started in the 15th century. Much like the honorary bearing swords used by other states such as England, Venice, and Florence. As we mentioned, the sword given to Hompesh was given under very different circumstances. There was no public ritual and ceremony, and the gift was given in private in the presence of the last Inquisitor of Malta. There is no published relazione, and the only proof of such a ceremony is Inquisitor Carpeña's letter to the Pope that can be found in the Inquisitor's archives, and the letter sent with the gift itself by the Pope in December 1797, which is documented, as I mentioned, in Hompesh's final pages of the Liber Consulorum Status in the archives. The following stock and pilier recorded ever to be given was in 1825 by Pope Leo XII to the son of the King of France, the Duke of Angoulême, and was the last stock and pilier to be ever given by a pope, reflecting the changing times, where the need to bestow a weapon as a symbol of defense of the faith seems no longer relevant. It is poignant how the order was given this papal honor as defenders of the faith only at the end of their long military career in the 18th century, nearly 2 centuries after the Great Siege, arguably the greatest example of the order being a defender of the faith. And moreover, when the honor itself dated back to the 14th century. So, in conclusion, the power of the sword's image has been revealed to be of major importance to the chivalric order of St. John, and was used in most of its dimensions, whether military or symbolic. This reflects the symbolism used by the secular powers of Europe. However, there remains the possibility that the order used swords more frequently in their symbolism due to their religio-chivalric nature. The scene of international gift-giving was a complex one, and the sword, as a gift, was given to the order numerous times, as you could see from my talk, from different quarters, including the 3 largest patrons, the kings of Spain, France, and the popes. Other swords were given internally in the form of gifts given by grandmasters themselves to their own island states, such as King Philip II's sword itself, which de Valette gave to Malta, de Valette's personal sword, or de Redin's personal sword. The associated public ritual has been described as a civic liturgy made by the ruling group to assert their authority over their subjects. And swords, as you could see, were utilized in various forms. In rituals, the sword was used as both a religious and civic relic, due to the symbolism it inherited from the Crusades. Most of the swords used in knights' rituals would have been of a symbolic nature and rarely used in practice. But some were indeed real weapons. For example, the sword given by Grandmaster de Redin may have been a real practical sword, even though a personal sidearm, still a weapon in itself, or de Valette's battle sword, which was an obvious weapon, not made for a gift itself. You also have the sword relic of St. Louis, which was purely practical in nature. Obviously, the de Valette sword, King Philip II's sword, I'm referring to, and the papal stocks were all purely ceremonial, and they were made never to be used. They were made as jewels. This shows that even in a time when these were made, where swords were still relevant weapons, a sword could also be manufactured and used intentionally for its secondary role, the role of a symbol, much like swords today, which only have a symbolic role. So that is all I have to say on the subject. There is much more information, but I only chose this part for this short lecture. I would like to thank the Malta Historical Society again. Before I go, if this whetted your curiosity, I encourage to keep an eye out for my upcoming book, which will be published by Heritage Malta. It's going to be called Swords of the Religion. And I thank you for listening, and I hope this was as pleasurable to you as it was to me, discovering all these jewels of information.